This video is going to go into some of the foundation or basic aspects of working with CSS gradients. First we'll look at linear gradients followed by radial gradients. Now looking at the supplied document, we can see that we have some gradients on screen, so I'm going to walk through some of the fundamentals or basics of what's happening here so we can better understand how it works. Currently, there's a number of sections in the HTML markup, and those have classes assigned to them. And those classes in the CSS are what we're really concerned about. So the first part is to use the background command, and instead of specifying a background color or background image, we're specifying a gradient. Within this gradient, we can create colors, any number of colors, and the colors can be designated in any color format that is valid for CSS. So RGB, RGBA, and colored name, hex colors. So for simplicity, I have mostly confined myself to just using basic color names. It makes it faster and easier to see what is happening. So we can see with the red, yellow, blue, but we can certainly go and change our values here. So if I were to change this to a different value, and we'll change the blue, I'll switch it to a hex color. So I'll leave it still somewhat in the blue family. And let's see how that's now created a different blue. I'll save the CSS, reload the page, and we can see how the color updates to that new value. If we want to add in a fourth value, just go back to a colored name, rewind, we can now see how we're adding in multiple values. So creating basic linear gradients is fairly straightforward. By default, they go from top to bottom, but we can change that by using the word to and specifying a direction, then a comma, and then whatever colors we want. So in this case, we say to right. Now the directions we can choose are top, bottom, left, and right. So we can specify how we want it to go in that case. So now we can see it goes red, yellow, blue, going to the right instead of the default of top to bottom. The next option that we can look at is we can have two directions. So if we say bottom left, we will see how the color is going to then be moving from the top right and moving towards the bottom left. The same way when we said to right, it went to the right. Now it's going to the bottom left. So it goes from corner to corner diagonally across the screen. And that can work, but perhaps as we work at this, we want to change something around, and we can specify with more precision. Instead of just to a corner, we can specify degrees. I'm just going to change that color so it's easier to see which one that is. Now when we refresh the page, we can see how now the angle is going across. It's not going corner to corner, but now we have an angle working its way across at 60 degrees. So just to figure out where it's working from, we'll start out at 0, and we can see 0 puts at the bottom, it's working our way up. So 0 is, our gradient is in that direction. So now if I say 90, recognizing that red is the beginning and blue is the end, so 90 degrees now points to the right. So our gradient goes to 0 at the top when we're at 0, which is kind of like at 12 o'clock. Now if we work clockwise around, I said 90 degrees, that's now to the right. If I say 180, then our gradient should be starting with red at the top and green at the bottom. So with 180, we can see indeed that is happening. So as our numbers are getting bigger, we're working our way clockwise around the circle. 0 is at the top, 90, 180, 270. Now we're back to 0. Now, this next example, there's a container that is filled with this green color, and a gradient has been placed on top. So if we look at this next example, the container is green. This gradient is placed on top. The gradient is smaller than the box, so we can see how that color exists outside of it to recognize how our color is showing up with transparency. The same way that I could combine together named colors and hex colors, in this case I'm combining together two transparent colors, or colors with transparent values, RGBA. Remembering that 1 is opaque, 0 is transparent, so it's the same color red, but it's going from full red that's solid and opaque to a completely transparent red. For alpha or transparent values, CSS uses the 0 to 1 scale, 1 being opaque, 0 being transparent. So we can see how that is applied to that. If I were to change this to 0.5, so now instead of being completely transparent, it's just partially transparent. Now when I refresh the page, we'll see how we can see through it. But it's still transparent because the red is now blending with the green, creating that darker, almost brownish color. Knowing that we can then use transparency with the gradients, we could, through creative layering of backgrounds or backgrounds and gradients of one object over another, we could now overlay this on top of an image. So that's a possibility that we can add into it as well. So if I comment out the color, and then we can set a background image, and we'll give it a URL with place cage. Now that's probably not quite enough to fill the space, so we will also set the background size to cover. And with that, we can look and see how the gradient sits on top of the image, and we can see its transparency. If I go back and make it go fully transparent at the end. So working with transparent gradients over images, we can get some really cool and amazing visual effects that work their way into what we're producing. Radial gradients are a different beast. They get a little bit more complex in terms of figuring out how they're going to work or what they're going to do when we see them turn up on screen. The key thing is if we use a radial gradient, by default it will be an ellipse. It doesn't start out as a circle. We have that as a property to designate, but the default setting, if you don't specify, will be an ellipse that goes into the area that is being filled by the gradient. Now, looking in the radial gradients, the same sort of thing, just a bunch of sections. This time we have different classes at work. Oh, one other thing before we go on to the radial gradients, I forgot I had this other option in here, so let's pull this example back, and what this allows us to do is see that not only can we have our gradient, but we can specify start and stop points for it. So this time it's going to be a blue transparent gradient, looking at the RGBA values. And let's see what the 25 and 50% do when we reload the page. So we can see that we now have a different value. So our gradient is ending at 50%. Now if I change that 50 to say 75, we should see that now the transparency is ending further down. If I don't make it fully transparent, but let's say down to 20%, so we can see the actual values as things start to spread their way out. So this now says our color will continue all the way down to 25% being solid blue and then start gradating to our transparent value. We go 50. So it's solid blue to the midpoint and then it starts to gradate the rest of the way down. So it's a different, let's go to even a different color so we can start to see how these values affect what is happening. So it tells our gradient starts at 50 and in this case ends at 55%, and then it's transparent green the rest of the way down through. So what we're creating are called stops. These are color stops. When we look at the spec, if we go on W3 Schools, the Mozilla Developer Network, or any of the other spec references, we will see that these values are referred to as color stops. So our gradient starts at 50, ends at 55%. If I go to, say, 75 again, we'll see that from the midpoint until the 3/4 point, that is where the gradient is taking place. So we've inserted little stops into our color, and then it remains the color from the stop afterward. So stops can be useful to shift or move the gradient around within that field. And we're able to use color stops in both radial and linear gradients. So once you get them working in one, then you can apply that knowledge to working in the other as well. So now on to radial gradients. The first thing is you will see the difference. Instead of saying linear gradient, it says radial gradient. But when we look at the result, same sort of thing. It starts at the middle, works its way out. It starts at the top, works its way down. So that's really the only kind of difference on radial gradients there. If we add in the word circle instead of the default of ellipse, now I could make this and say ellipse, and we'll see that there is no difference because I just specified the default. So this first property is circle or ellipse, and if you don't specify, it will be ellipse by default. Now, the interesting and sometimes confusing part of working with radial gradients is now specifying how they are going to size themselves within their enclosing box. And we can see I've added some comments in here to help us understand that a little bit more. This is information coming directly from the Mozilla Developer Network. They have a pretty good page talking about gradients, so we can use that as a starting point. Closest side means the gradient is going to size itself so that it will contain the shape of the gradient until it hits the closest side of the box. So if I go down and see closest side, so the gradient is going until it hits the closest side, that is sizing it. Now here the gradient is going to stretch until it hits the closest corner, but because it's centered here, it's going to be hitting one of the 4 corners within this box, but that's why it gets bigger. Now on farthest side, the circle is going to stretch itself until the edge of the gradient hits. And with the gradient, what we're talking about is that transition, because it goes red, yellow, blue. So when we stop the transition from yellow into blue, and then it will be blue for the rest of the way out, that is what is hitting that edge. So we have a solid blue, but if we were to draw circle lines, the circle or ellipse line, I guess not a circle line, but the ellipse line where it hits the edge over here, that is now on farthest side. So we're hitting a far side versus in this case, this one is smaller because it's hitting the close side. You can see how it doesn't actually correspond or look quite the same now. If we say it stretches until the gradient goes and hits the farthest corner, well, the farthest and closest corner are going to be pretty close to the same in this regard because our box is indeed the same size. Now, what's interesting that we can do is we can take and shift our gradients around a little bit and specify where we want that center point to be. Now, in this example, I've also switched it to a circle and I've chosen closest side and we've moved it so now it's putting it at 50% and 20%. So 50% here, 20% here. So that tells us the first value is going to be on the horizontal axis, the second value is on the vertical axis, and then that puts that center point right here at 50% and 20%. Now, if I go and change this to 50% once more and reload, we can see the circle grew because now the gradient is now stretching until it hits the closest side up here. Now, if I change that value around, we can now see how the value is moving its way over. Now, let's change this to a much smaller amount, and because now it's hitting that side, it shrinks it down. So the size of the gradient, depending on the size spec that we reference, is going to change how it appears on our screen. It usually is going to require experimentation with different values to figure out how best to get the results that you are looking for. Now, if you hop onto W3 Schools, you can see there's a whole section on CSS gradients under their CSS section. A lot of information to follow and learn about, so you can go, woohoo, that's awesome. The MDM network has additional information on it. You can read up and study on creating repeating gradients if you're interested in that. I'm not going to go into those in detail right now, but you're welcome to explore that, take the knowledge you have, and grow with that. CSS Tricks has a nice article on about everything related to CSS, and in this one, even though it's old, it talks about CSS gradients and gives us some information on them. And what's also kind of cool about this is you can see the result, you can click over and see the CSS, you can click over and see the HTML that's at work, so they're pretty cool that you can do that. And if you want to try it or edit the code like on W3 Schools, then you click on Edit on CodePen, and it pulls up a page where then you have those different values, and then you can just start changing things. And I change it and it live updates on the screen, so that's really cool. So CodePen is a great way to experiment with different things as we work with it. Now, for those of you who just want to create a gradient much like we would inside of, say, Photoshop, where we have a gradient editor, what you'll see is we are able to work with this gradient editor and create any kind of gradient. And it really is about the same as working with Photoshop, where I have a transparency on one axis, on the other I have the colors that I'm adding. And as we do this, if I look down here, it's now giving me CSS that I can copy paste into my style sheet, which makes it really kind of cool. So, and then if we look here, let's change this, change that around. You can see how it changed it. It put a direction in here where it now put in a linear gradient to the right, so we're able to specify that. We can specify sizes. So ColorZilla's gradient editor is really cool and can do lots of really neat things. So if you're struggling on how to create your gradient, this can be a great resource to help you work through that.